Good afternoon, everyone. This is Steve Wilson from the State Water Survey. Thanks for joining us for our webinar today, What Environmental Health Professionals Need to Know About Wells. Um, okay. As far as this webinar, if you're new, these are part of a national program funded through RCAP, the Rural Community Assistance Partnership, with funding from US EPA to support well owners and those that work with them. We do a lot of work with the National Environmental Health Association, NEHA, and one of those pieces is that we provide CEs through these webinars for those that attend live. And yeah, I'll talk more about that in a second. These materials do follow, to some degree, our private well class program. You can find these webinars located on the private well class webpage under webinars, but there's also a 10-lesson class that's meant to help. It's kind of a well owner 101, meant to help well owners understand how to take care of their well better, things they should know, things about treatment, where to find local resources, all those things. And so anyone who is on the webinar today, if you haven't taken the class, we recommend you go and sign up. It's free. It sends you a PDF once a week for 10 weeks, and they're yours, basically, quote, to keep. And if you read through them all, you'll have a better understanding of all the things necessary as a well owner. We do record all our webinars, and we have quite a robust YouTube page. I think in our last progress report, in the current progress report we're completing, we've reached 2 million views of our videos, which include not only these webinars, but other materials that we've developed over the last 5 or 6 years. So you all could ask questions at the beginning when you registered for the event today, and we'll get to some of those at the end. But if your question isn't answered or you have other questions based on things I say today, there will be time for follow-up questions. Katie Buckley, who I'll introduce in a second, is monitoring the chat and the question box on your YouTube bar or window. And if you'll put questions in there, we track those during the webinar and we'll answer them at the end. So yeah, I think that's everything there. As far as NEHA CEs, continuing education credits, we do offer this class every 6 to 7 months. And so if you've, depending on when your credentialing cycle starts, so for example, if your credentialing cycle ended on 3/31/23, which was last month, so you're in a new one today, 4/1/23, you're starting a 2-year cycle. So if you take this today, you can't get credit for it again the next time we offer it until after 4/1/25. We are also an Illinois LEHP provider, credit provider, and so you can contact us at info@privatewellclass. There's materials in the handouts directory on our window on your GoToWebinar window to get some of those things. And yeah, we've shown the dates here of the last 3 times we've delivered this that are within the 2-year window of today. All right. RCAP, who's RCAP? Well, the Rural Community Assistance Partnership is a national organization with its national offices in Washington, D.C., but it's really a true partnership. It's made up of 6 regional nonprofit organizations. These are technical assistance and training organizations that you may have heard of by their, by their own name, so to speak, like Communities Unlimited in the South, that provide technical assistance and training not only to well owners, but to rural communities for their water and wastewater operators, and also for economic development. And so they provide a lot of services. They're funded by US EPA, USDA, and HUD. They do housing as well in some of the regions. And they also are a lender through USDA for private well loans for low-income folks that meet USDA's qualifications that need either a new well, a repair, add treatment, or septic work. And so they're a good group to know, especially if you're an EHP at a county or local health district or department. You should know who the RCAP folks are in your state that are working on private well issues. They'd be willing to put on events, have workshops for your staff. They can provide resources. They do well assessments, which I'll probably get to at some point here. And they're just really a good partner. And each of the 6 regions has a lead that's really a private well expert, if you will. And they can answer a lot of questions. And again, they're local. So we're in Illinois. So we're part of the Great Lakes Community Action Partnership are the folks that come to Illinois and do assessments and work with us and when we're working in the state of Illinois. Okay, so we're at the Illinois State Water Survey. I'm really proud of working here. Just put that out front. That's why I show these pictures at the beginning. It's a really different, unique organization. It was a state agency for over 100 years until 2008, when we were moved into the University of Illinois. We've always actually been here on campus, but we were part of DNR and other state agencies before that. We have I learned yesterday that between the scientific surveys, we have over 60 state mandates that we observe and do work for the state, but technically we're not a state agency, we're not regulatory. I'm fortunate, we do a lot of education and outreach like this program. We also do a lot of applied research looking at things like arsenic in groundwater or lead or even Legionella. We're doing some work there now. So the water survey was started in 1895 because of the cholera and typhoid outbreaks. And so the state legislature established us to investigate that information. And so over our history, this is a broken glass plate slide from 1913, but we did investigations of typhoid outbreaks. This one was in Rockford. They went so far as in the day, a lot of times it was a communal place where everyone got milk. For instance, I a lot of times show a Pana slide, Pana, Illinois, where they had a typhoid outbreak, and it turned out it was the tank that held the milk at the Pana Ice Cream Company that was tainted with typhoid, and everyone used the same bucket to scoop out milk. Well, in this case, they were investigating a dairy route to see if E. Erickson, whoever that might have been, it was his dairy route, and to see if it might have been part of the reason why folks were getting typhoid. And it turned out over the course of several months, there were only 8 cases linked to his route, but there were 112 or more cases overall in Rockford at the time. And so we investigated that and figured out what happened. And it's all documented in our files, which is really cool. These used to be prevalent. You can see the little tin cup on the ground in front of the boards over the well here. This is in a park. We haven't been able to figure out what town this is. It's been several of us have really tried to look into this and can't figure it out. But you can tell looking at the cars, this is probably in the 20s or 30s. And you know, these hand pumps were all taken down. Now they're not allowed to be that way because they're a source of contamination because they have air to them and those things. We also are the state's repository for all the well logs. So I just wanted to show some of the historical logs. Back in the 30s, when we were trying to get past the stock market crash, you know, there's a reconstruction time then where the government funded a lot of workers in each state to do different things. In Illinois, one of the things they hired folks to do was to inventory well logs. So we have a ton of well logs from the early 30s that describe wells that were identified by a person hired to go out and identify those things. So this is a well that was dug about 60 years ago, the landowner said, and it's 135 feet deep. So it's, I just want to, it's a 5-inch hole or 5-foot hole. So someone or a number of someone's dug a 135-foot, 5-foot diameter hole in the ground to get water. And I find that just amazing. And, you know, they're using 2 buckets in a chain. It's the deepest hand, the person who was doing this is in Schuyler County, Illinois, 135 feet deep. The water is at 60. Don't ask me how they did this, no idea, but I know at one point they switched back to a chain and buckets because it was better than using a hand pump to get the water lifted that high. So enough of that. Again, my name is Steve Wilson. I'm a groundwater hydrologist at the State Water Survey. I've actually been here, including my time I started as a student at the U of I, for nearly 40 years. And so with me is Katie Buckley, who is part of our private well program. She's a water resources outreach specialist. She'll work with you on the CE forms that you need if you're an EHP, as well as she's collecting the questions today. And looks like we already have at least one that folks have asked in the chat box or question box. And so again, yeah, we do these every month. We enjoy doing that. One thing we've started doing, partly because we've been asked by our sponsor, is to ask everyone what their role is in the private well world. And so Katie, do you want to go ahead and launch a poll question? And we do track this stuff. We track your attendance and how many minutes you're actually on the webinar, especially if you're getting CEs. And so if you're in this for credit, please answer the poll question, although we hope everyone does. Gives us a better idea of who we're working with.
Yep, so I launched the poll question, so everybody who's in attendance today, feel free to answer which role best describes you as a participant. We'll give it a few moments.
Yeah, and I'll say that, especially because we do offer continuing education credit, we've seen that a lot more regulatory folks or health professionals and some well professionals are on our webinars. And, we've taken the approach that you all, each of you, may reach dozens to hundreds of well owners in your local jurisdiction. And so the more information you have and can share, and the more consistent our message can be to all well owners across the country, that's a benefit. There's things like even how to disinfect your well or shock chlorinate it. There are so many different documents out there that have different methodologies or levels of detail that it's really frustrating when someone is using an 8-page set of documentation to disinfect their well and somebody else only has a half a sheet of paper. And so we're hoping that through our program and working with all of you, we can kind of standardize some of those things so that well owners are getting the same information and not bad information. I've had well owners tell me, well, I just had someone tell me I should just pour a cup of bleach down my well every month. That's about the worst advice you could give a well owner. And so understanding those things is one reason why we think it's actually a benefit to our program and for well owners that we have more professionals participating. Sorry, Katie, I kind of took over there.
No, you're good. We have 86% voted, so I'm going to go ahead and close the poll. And I'll share the results really quick, and then I'll close it, and then Steve, you can continue.
Yeah.
It looks like of the folks that answered, about 84%, 85% of you are either health professionals or regulatory agencies, which is exactly what Steve had said. All right, I will hide that, and Steve, you can take it from here.
Okay. So today we're going to talk about challenges and issues we face as professionals, well owners and their attitudes a little bit, and then just some basic information about groundwater and wells. And then, yeah, one of my pet peeves, not necessarily a pet peeve, that's probably poor wording, but one of the things that we see a lot is the gap between groundwater and health professionals. Groundwater professionals know their set of issues and have expertise. Health professionals have theirs. Sometimes they work great together, as they should. Other times they don't, and sometimes that's because one regulates the other. A lot of times a health professional may be with a health department that has the regulatory authority over drillers and their licenses and those sorts of things. But our take on things is we need to find a way to always work together because yeah, and I'll talk about that more. And then at the end, I'll talk about our private well class program a little more. So there are lots of issues as well. We see this all the time as far as things in the news about private wells or contamination or, today it's PFAS, and in 2015 it was lead. In the early 2000s it was arsenic, and there will be other things. I think the next thing on the horizon is manganese. We know now it causes neurological problems, but it's not regulated through the Safe Drinking Water Act, only as a secondary contaminant, and that's probably going to change. And some states have already created regulations for levels of manganese in public drinking water supplies. And so that's, as we basically use the Safe Drinking Water Act limits, the MCLs, as our guide for private well owners, which in many cases have no real rules they have to follow. It really is. It's about public health protection. What can we do to make sure that the water people are drinking is safe? Source water protection. What other things happen around aquifers or in groundwater protection areas and those sorts of things? And obviously just general water quality and understanding, especially natural water quality, that may be a problem as far as going back to the public health side. In addition to that, though, most of the time when we hear about wells or groundwater issues, it's because they're in the news. Drought, flooding, I already mentioned PFAS contamination. Those things usually are a driver. And one thing I'll mention is when those things happen, it's really a teachable moment for all of us because more people are interested, more people are asking questions. It's a chance to educate well owners more about their well and why they need to sample and some of those things. And so there are also things that we've learned basically are even when a community, especially a rural community, may issue a boil order, whether that's through, it's on the radio or whatever it might be, a lot of times those community water supply operators get questions from well owners nearby asking if it means their well could be affected. And for those of you that work with community water supplies, you understand that most boil orders are due to water main breaks. And so it has nothing to do with the groundwater or anybody's well anywhere away from town. And it shows a lack of understanding, if you will, of well owners about the issues that could affect their well. And so again, that's a time when a community operator can explain those issues to someone and help them understand what they need to know about around their well where they may have some issues. So the challenges we all face, especially again going back to EHPs and health departments, there are such differences between states. 2 states don't have well code, Pennsylvania and Alaska. And even what the definition of a private well is, whether how they permit and submit logs, Mississippi doesn't require you to file a log, I believe, if it's under 5 inches in diameter. And so there's a lot of areas in rural Mississippi where a county may have very few or no well logs. And that, it's not because there aren't wells, it's because the drillers aren't required to submit them. And those all happened at different times. In Illinois, the law was passed to require logs in 1968. We have about 450,000 well logs in our files, and we know there's closer to 800,000 wells in use in Illinois. But in New York, they didn't pass a law requiring logs to be filed until 2000. And there they probably have 10 to 15% of the logs for wells that are actually in use in the state, which is, it's unfortunate, but it's the way it is. And, say New Jersey versus Pennsylvania, about 20 years ago, New Jersey passed a law that required a water sample be collected and provided to the state lab anytime a home was sold with a well, any transaction that included a well, property transaction. And because of that, they collect water quality samples on about 13,000 wells a year. And over 20 years now, they have well over 200,000 samples, and they sample for everything. And now they have a database, and you can go on their website and look at where there's issues like arsenic or anything else. It's really a proactive and cool thing now, 20 years down the road. Whereas, again, I mentioned Pennsylvania doesn't have well construction code and doesn't license drillers other than making them pay a fee for a license. And because most county or local health departments, they're not adequately trained, a lot of that is because it's not necessarily, private wells are not a mandatory program like septic is or some of the other things they do. And so in a lot of cases, it may be there's a champion in that office who cares about private wells more, or they get a lot of questions, and so they've developed that expertise. But what it leads to is a really unorganized local approach to support for well owners across the country that may vary from one health district to another, and or one county to another. And so that's a big challenge when you're trying to help well owners and kind of raise the overall awareness of what well owners know and how to take care of their wells. Is that in some areas they're getting support, in some areas they just aren't, and there's no government entity in place to do that. And so, and also, I'm not sure I say this here, I may be jumping a slide, but the two things we see as the biggest issues related to private wells are, one, wells are grandfathered in when a well construction code is passed. And so we see, like even in Illinois, the law was passed in 1968, but there are a lot of wells that were drilled before 1968 that are still in use, don't meet well construction code, or old dug wells. I grew up in an old hand dug well. My grandpa hand dug in 1933. It's 4.5 feet diameter. It's uncemented brick, and it's only 14 feet deep. It's in a ravine, so it could collect more water. That's in the middle of a pasture that has livestock. So never safe. My whole life, that's what I drank growing up. And so those wells shouldn't be in service, and they are, and we see them all the time. And it's all those things that that's one is poor well construction that causes a lot of problems, and the other is well owner knowledge. And I alluded to that about the boiler thing, but a lot of times well owners don't know the basics they need to know to be to have a private well. We try to tell them that they're the water operator for a very small water supply, and they need to have that knowledge and take it seriously. I wanted to mention Pennsylvania just because it's an interesting deal. You can pay a $60, I think it's $60 fee to get a license, but you, me, everybody on this call can do that. And so one time when I mentioned that, someone commented in the chat that yes, we do have licenses for drillers. Well, even on their own website, they say that a license does not imply the driller has knowledge of proper well drilling or construction practice. There are no statewide standards for siting or construction, and there's no testing. You don't have to pass a test to be a licensed driller in Pennsylvania through their program. It's and there's no continuing education, which in every other state there are rules, and you have to pass an exam, and you have to get continuing education credit to show that you know what you're doing. And this is all because of Pennsylvania's state legislature, which is a really sad state of the world, in my opinion. But what's happened in Pennsylvania, and why I wanted to mention it, is because they lack the legislative backing to provide, some professional assurances for their well drillers. Both some of the municipalities that mentioned here, or counties, excuse me, have created standards of their own that if you drill in that area, you have to follow, or some counties require that you have the certification from the National Groundwater Association. And it's also led to a lot of public service groups like, I can't think of the name of it now, but there's a lot of groups in like environmental groups and things in Pennsylvania that have taken up the charge and provide education. Penn State Extension has one of the most robust well owner education programs for any state in the country. So there's some positives that have come out of that, out of necessity. But again, still, as a Pennsylvania homeowner, you need to be careful. Boy, excuse me. I had something go down the wrong pipe there. Okay, so I did get ahead of myself. Hang on one second. Wow, I apologize. I mentioned this already, so I won't go over anymore, but these are the two things that we see as the biggest issues affecting the quality of water in a well. And showing 2 examples of old dug wells where we've sampled. These are both in Illinois. I am so sorry, I'm still muted. Well, let me go back here. Okay. Yeah, I won't belabor this because we already talked about it, but this is just 2 wells that we've sampled in Illinois as part of research projects looking at water quality and the issues we see with a lot of these wells that just aren't protective. Okay, so the other big issue we have is that well owners are really a diverse group. They're not all in rural areas, they're not all in urban areas. Man, they come from every social, economic, and education class. So you really have to understand the well owners in your area to understand how to work with them. You know, some have lived on a well their entire life. They're 4th generation in their community. All right, I apologize. I need 1 second to try to clear my throat. Wow. I hope that doesn't happen. I apologize. So they could be a 4th generation on a well on a farm. They may be someone who just moved to an area with a private well that's always grown up in the city. You also have rural areas like where I grew up, where there's maybe 3 homes on a square mile, to Cook County, Illinois, which is, you know, Chicago proper, basically, with some outline with some of the closer suburbs, where if I said to most people in Illinois, there's 3,000 wells in Cook County, they'd say no way. But there are, and it's because of these unincorporated areas between municipal boundaries that just were never made part of any of the urban communities there. Barb Luukkonen, who was retired from University of Minnesota Extension, along with several others, did a really large survey, 2,700 questionnaires sent out in 3 states. And they did a variety of things looking at social dynamics, basically, of why well owners don't test. So they sent out surveys in Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Michigan. They put $2 bills in there, and some they a coupon for a free test, so they did both. And you can see the percentage here of the return rate for the questionnaires, which is interesting as for social scientists on its own, I imagine. But they also gave folks a laundry list of why they haven't tested. And on the right here are the top 10, and they could answer using multiple, they could answer multiple times. So that's why these percentages don't add up. But over half said, we've been drinking it for years, no issue, right? And so don't know what to test for, you know, blah, blah, all the way down to number 10, I don't want to know. And, you know, I've had that happen to me when sampling wells in the field. We were doing some arsenic sampling in a rural subdivision with private wells. And a well owner said to me, you can sample my well as long as you do it when I'm not home and don't send me the results. And so, you know, that really piqued my interest about why someone would want that. Well, it turned out he was trying to sell his house. And in Illinois, there's a form you have to fill out that's legally binding. And one of the questions is, do you know anything adverse about your well or your septic? And so he wanted to be able to honestly say he didn't know. And so, you know, it's really interesting what drives folks to test or not to test, a lot of it. And there's, again, and I'll mention this in the questions because someone asked, but we do a class just on outreach to well owners. And yeah, I'll get to that later. But when people were asked how worried about health risks from untreated well water, and when they asked the folks that had never tested their well, 87% still said they were only slightly or not worried, just assuming groundwater's safe. And that's part of the issue, is how do we convince folks that you can have the, you know, you can have a properly installed and built well. It could be fairly deep, well grouted, all the things that it needs to be, but you can still have contamination. And unless you test, you don't know. You know, there's natural occurring things like uranium or arsenic that can cause health issues. And so our job is how do we get that message out to everyone? Okay, so yeah, so some of these are on us. I didn't know what to test for. I don't know how to test. Didn't know what I should. Didn't know that I should test. That's more of us as professionals needing to do a better job of reaching out to well owners. There's also a lack of knowledge and just assuming that it's fine, or for whatever reason, again, I don't want to know. And so there's a number of issues, assuming it's safe, just not taking it, understanding the risks they actually have. And well water very well could be completely safe. In a lot of wells it is, but for any individual well, you don't know unless you've tested it, and that's kind of the message. So, and again, why are they hard to reach? Every demographic, they believe that groundwater is safe to drink, just because it's from the well in the ground. It's the same as people don't want to know. It's the same as going to the dentist or doctor. I know I need to go to the dentist, but I'm just going to put it off because it doesn't sound pleasant. I know it's going to cost money, blah, blah, blah. Saying no one's gotten sick yet. A lot of these things like arsenic, are not a acute problem. They're a chronic one. And so drinking water with arsenic in it over a period of a number of years can lead to health outcomes that are adverse health outcomes. And just the independence of being a well owner, in some states, we have people who try to build their own wells because they found out how they could do that on the internet, even though it's, not grouted, it's very shallow in a sandy area. They're applying, there's farm ground near there where they're applying pesticides and nitrate, all those things. But just a general distrust of the government is also an issue when you try to reach people from any kind of authority or agency or even a university where a lot of those folks don't feel like someone from a university understands their situation. And I know because I grew up that way in a very rural area, a very small rural community yeah. So, so a little bit about aquifers and wells. They're really the way I break out wells, and there's a lot of ways you could do that, are really based on where they're getting their water from. So a dug or bored well is usually it's a large diameter well, 3 foot or more in diameter typically. That's shallow and it's collecting water from the water table. So like the well I grew up on, it's all clay, but it's in a ravine. It's in the, it's water runs to it even over land because it's in a low spot in a pasture. But it's there because there was no sand and gravel aquifer or bedrock aquifer that they knew about at the time, and so it's really like a cistern in that it holds enough water to supply a home. In most cases, a bored or dug well, which dug means hand dug, bored means bored by a machine. These wells are less than 40 or 50 feet deep, a lot of times shallower than that. And they're getting water that seeps in slowly from the water table. So the idea is it's a storage vessel. It's a 3 or 4 foot diameter by 20 feet of water is a lot of water. But in the morning you take a shower and you use water for cooking or start running the dish or washer, the water level goes down in the well, and then during the day or overnight, water seeps back in from the water table to fill it back up. They can many times be over pumped. If you leave, I know in our case, we didn't have a lot of volume because it was only 14 feet deep. We had livestock, and if I left a hose in our horse tank, and this happened several times when I was a kid, our well would go dry, and if I left it on and forgot about it, and then we wouldn't have water for a couple days, which was not very good. Drilled or driven sand and gravel wells are in a sand and gravel aquifer. And I'll talk about the differences here, and the other are drilled wells into bedrock. and consolidated rock. And water coming from a bedrock well is much different than water coming from a sand and gravel well. And I'll talk about those differences in a minute. But in some cases you may have choices. If you're in the northern part of the country where there's glaciation, there's going to be several sand and gravel aquifers possibly before you even hit bedrock. And in those cases, you could stop in the, like in Champaign County, Illinois, where I live. We have 2 sand and gravel aquifers. One's 80 or 90 feet below land surface. The other is a couple hundred feet below land surface, and the bottom one then sits on top of bedrock. But you could also drill into the bedrock and hit a limestone aquifer even farther down. And so there's the thing is, in most cases, there's no reason to drill all the way into bedrock when you have ample water supply in the sand and gravel. In some cases, you may have no choice, and that's why you have to put in a dug or bored well, or these days a bored well. And there's just areas, I can think in my head of an area in Sangamon County, Illinois, and in Peoria County, Illinois, where there's just clay or alluvial type deposits or less deposits that don't really have enough. There's no great water storage in those, and so there's a lot of bored wells in those areas. Even the southern third of Illinois, there's a lot of bored wells, and that's just because there's no good aquifer to speak of. So you should know those things where you live. You should know what types of aquifers have potential for water supply in your area if you're a professional, and for your well if you're a well owner. And even if you have a large diameter well, a dug or bored well, to know if there's actually a water supply further down if you drill deeper. It may be possible. Your state geological survey or USGS or other resource agency in the state can help you answer those kind of questions. And so this is a bored well being put in, large diameter well. You can see the 2 gentlemen up on the rig, and that big circle, that's where that bucket goes through that, goes down, and it's an auger. It pulls up 3 feet or so of dirt at a time, and you can see below their feet that there's a hole there in the ground where they're putting in. That's probably a 3.5 foot diameter bucket. And then when they put the concrete tile in as the casing, it'll have 3 foot inside diameter of area for a well. I always find this picture interesting because to me this looks like a soybean field, and why you'd put a shallow well in a field that has row crops where they likely use pesticides and fertilizers beyond me. And again, water seeps in from the water table through there may be like a 3-inch sand lens when this material was deposited that this taps into, and that's providing most of the water. I'll show you an example of what this looks like from a side view. These are all dug and bored wells. The one on the right is more like what I explained with the 3 foot diameter concrete tile. It's got a big concrete lid. You need a pry bar to take that off, and it stores a lot of water. And there's sections of 4 foot concrete tile that all the way down, and they're not cemented together. And so there's a lip, there's a male and female end to each of those pieces of tile, and they just sit on top of each other, and water can seep in at those joints. The one on the bottom left is also a large diameter well. It's just that this one has 10 feet of 6-inch pipe going down to a concrete pad that then opens up into the larger well. And this is a newer style that allows you to put more clay material in the upper 10 feet, if you will, when you're replacing the borehole, so that it's less likely for surface infiltration to get down in the well. And then the one on the top is an old dug well. It's on the side of a hill. There's a field above it, up gradient. All that mud that's on the lower right, and the way those posts look so different is because they've been rubbed. They're scratching posts for cattle. So the cattle are doing their business right there. It's covered with 2x10s and 2x8s with pieces of tin and concrete blocks. Snakes, mice, other kinds of critters can get in there and fall in the well, and those things do happen. And not too many months ago on our webinar, we had someone say that their father's, when they got to their father's house, he lives out in the country, and his water tasted really funny, so they went out and opened up his dug well, and there were 20 or so snakes in the well, and he'd been drinking that water. And so it's a real thing, and it's knowing what to do about these wells and how to convince people to find a way to seal them properly or abandon them and put in a new well is really important. So these are the two bored wells that, this is from Illinois Co-op Extension, but it's actually from our Illinois Department of Public Health's well code. These are acceptable ways to put in a large diameter well. The one on the left has a concrete tile coming all the way to the surface. Now today we wouldn't have the pipe coming all the way out to the top. It would be like the one on the left or on the right, where it's got a pitless unit 4 or 5 feet below land surface, and that goes to the house to keep everything below the frost line. But you can see the one with the concrete pad on top and the other one. The water level is the same in both. These wells are side by side, so to speak, but there's 4-foot sections of 36-inch casing. There's concrete tile. They're set on top of each other, and water comes in at the seams. The natural water table is where the little triangle is in the water line, and it shows some sand lenses that may be contributing to water in the well, but you're basically getting water from the water table. And the recommendation, if you're going to run the tile all the way to the surface, is to put concrete or clay fill that's considered an aquitard. It doesn't let water flow through in the upper 10 feet to protect shallow water from being able to get into the well. So if even if you spray your yard or you have a garden nearby and you're using bug dust or whatever it might be, and then there's a rainstorm, that stuff's going to start infiltrating into the ground. And so by having the upper 10 feet eliminated from accepting water into the well, you're helping prevent some of those shallow things from causing problems. And the one on the right is the one with the 6-inch pipe to the surface, but it's also got the same concrete pad below, and you're just, again, they've listed clean earth fill here, or you could use concrete or some kind of approved material that prevents water flow from getting from the surface down to where the water's coming in the well. But again, both of these, when you think about it, there's, if those are 4-foot sections, we've got about 11 feet of water or 12 feet, or I'd say 10 to 11 feet of water in each of these wells, the way they're designed. And so, you take that by the volume of a 3-foot diameter circle, there's a fair amount of water in there for any specific timed use, like when you're taking showers in the morning and that sort of stuff. And then once the water level in the well goes down, the surrounding material has a higher water level, and so water seeps in to try to make that level again. Okay, so sand and gravel wells use a well screen, and that's what this image is. And the size of the slots in that screen are dependent on the material that you encounter. If it's a fairly large gravel that your well's finished in, then these slots can be a little bigger. If it's a finer sand, then the slots have to be much smaller. The whole idea, a well screen, just like the screen in your kitchen door or your outside door, your storm door, is to let it lets the water out, but it lets the water in, but keeps the sand out, like your storm door lets the air in and keeps the bugs out. And so the driller will usually make that decision on site unless they've drilled nearby and already know a lot about the aquifer and the size of the material. But when they drill a well, sand and gravel well, a lot of times they're collecting the cuttings as they come up, if it's reverse rotary, and then they're making a decision on the screen. They also use a gravel pack, which is a single-sized grained sand or gravel. It's called gravel pack no matter how fine it is. It may not be actually a gravel. Generally, it's a sand, but it's meant to be just big enough that it can't go through the well screen, but as small as possible above that so that it'll capture any other sand or material that tries to get into the well. You don't want sand to get in your well. As you start pumping, that sand will get into your pump. Sand, it'll scour your pipes. I just worked with a well owner who had an elbow, a pipe in their basement that started leaking, and it turned out it was because he's been pumping sand from his well. They were worried about corrosive water corroding the pipes, and it turned out it wasn't that. It's because they've been pumping fine sand. And again, the screen size is based on the size of the sand in the formation and the geologic formation. It's usually stainless steel. Casing can be steel or PVC. And how large a well is really depends on the amount needed. Sand and gravel wells, if they're very thick, typically have a lot of water available. So especially like in bottom ground near a river, those alluvial sands that are from past when the river was wider, before glaciers melted and all that stuff, they're huge sources of water. It's sandy soil. So you'll see irrigation wells that are 12, 14, 16-inch diameter. They only may be 40 or 50 feet deep, but they'll pump 1,500 to 2,000 gallons a minute. And because it's sand, water can flow through it so easily, you can support a well like that. This is a well log from a sand and gravel well. On the bottom right is the geologic formation they went through. So this driller called it tight sand at 260, which is hard to drill through when it's really fine. And so that really means fine sand, and then sand, and then sand and gravel. What typically happens is it's just like, when the larger particles settle out first. If you have a river that's moving fast, it's all gravel on the bottom of the riverbed. But if it's a really slow area of the river, it might be finer sand or even silt that's been able to build up on the bottom of the river. And that's because the speed or velocity of the water dictates what size particles can fall out and which ones are still picked up in solution, if you will. And that's what happened when these sands were deposited. So the largest particles fell out first when the water had a higher velocity, and then as it slowed down over time, finer materials were able to fall out. And so that's why typically in a sand and gravel aquifer, the upper portion of it is much finer sand, and you want to drill past that because it's much more likely to get through a screen and cause problems. And so here they went to 290 and put the screen in from 291 to 295. It's only 4 foot of screen, and it's when they got into the bigger particled material, the gravel. You can see here too what on number 22, they used SDR 21 and 17 pipe, and then a stainless steel screen. Has all the information about who the driller is, how they grouted it, on the beginning and the other side, the size of hole they drilled, what kind of pump they put in, what the yield is that they estimated. So the driller's estimated yield says 40 gallons per minute. If you look at number 23 and 24, they did a pumping test after they drilled the well. Static water level is 159 feet. The pumping level was 165, so it went down 6 feet, pumping at 20 gallons a minute. They didn't list the number of hours, but typically they'll pump at least an hour. And so, that's very little drawdown. And since the well goes down to 295, there's 140 feet of water in this well, and pumping at 20 gallons a minute, which is much more than a home will use, only dropped at 6 feet. So it's a really solid aquifer that can pump a lot of water. And they put in a 15 gallon per minute pump at 186 feet. And so they don't expect the water level to ever get that low. But the nice thing is, if another user in the area, or say a factory got built close by or even like an ethanol plant that was all of a sudden pulling 1 million gallons a day out, and the water level near this well dropped 20 or 30 feet, they have over 100 feet that they could drop the pump and still provide water to the well, because it's actually getting in the well only at the screen from 290 to 295. And so, we see that a lot. This well's artesian, because the water level came up above the sand into the clay, which means it's under pressure. And so, yeah, this is a really good log. It's fairly new, that's probably why. But it talks about, it gives you all the information you need to understand. And that's why if you're a professional, especially with the health department, and you have logs for your well owners, this is an important thing for them to understand. And it's one of the messages we make clear in all of our presentations, is that if you can find your log, it's a really valuable piece of information to understand what's going on and where your water is coming from. They also provided this little diagram, and it's in our records. And the state of Illinois uses this P number that was decided, 60 years ago, whatever. And so this well is 483-373-02 is this piece of paper, but that 483-373 is their well ID. Okay, the other type of well is a bedrock well. And the big difference is water doesn't flow through rock. It flows through the cracks and fissures in the rock. So if I have a solid piece of rock in my hand, water doesn't flow through it, it flows around it. Whereas if I have a jar of sand, water exists throughout the sand, right? And it shows it on this diagram. It shows the overburden as being this tan color, and then saturated overburden where the water table is as being blue. And if it's in a sand and gravel aquifer, if it's fairly uniform sand, it might have a porosity of 30%, which means for every 100 feet of aquifer, if you took all the sand away, you'd still have 30 feet of water, which is a lot, right? And it can flow through it really easily. So in bedrock, it's only flowing through the fractures. So when you put in a bedrock well, you're trying to drill down and hit fractures in the rock. And that's where the water's coming in. And the issue with that is you can't put a well casing all the way down through the well bore, because then you're cutting off the fractures. So typically, casing is seated in the rock, which means it only goes down into the rock 10 to 20 feet. After that, the rock itself, the hole you put in the rock, acts as the casing. And that's so that you can take advantage of the fractures. Like in this diagram, there's one fracture near the top of the gray part where the bedrock is, that is that's above the casing. So that fracture isn't contributing to the well at all. But the fractures down by the pump, that's an open hole. And so those fractures actually are connected to the well bore, and that's where the water's coming from. And in this case, the water level in the well is up above the top of the bedrock just a little bit. You can see where the blue stops in the well. But the issue with this is that if a well is drilled and it only hits 1 or 2 fractures, then those fractures are contributing all the water. And it depends on how big they are. They could be the size of a cave in the right situation. Then, there's probably a lot of water available. It could be that they're very small and they're not very well connected, which means your well may not produce very much, for one, but it also means that water could be coming from farther away. Because as soon as you start pumping your well and you lower the water level there, water flows based on pressure. So it's trying to fill back up to be level. It wants the water level to be level across the whole aquifer where the water's connected hydraulically. And so you're pulling water in through these fractures, and it could be over a large distance. Or in another situation, you may have bedrock right at the surface. And I know today we have laws that say a bedrock well typically has to have at least 50 feet of casing, but that wasn't always the case. I worked in New York, up by Buffalo, where bedrock's at the surface, and we ran across a bunch of wells that were drilled many, many years ago. They were 300 or 400 foot wells, so everybody's like, oh, my well's 300 feet deep, it's fine. But one only had 16 feet of casing. Another one only had like 22 or 23 feet of casing. After that, it's an open hole. So any fractures that went back up towards the surface, or any surface infiltration that could get to 16 feet, we're going to get in that well. And so they can be much more of a risk depending on what type of casing they have, as far as how deep that is. And so, the example I share a lot is if you take two identical 200-foot wells, one sand and gravel, it's got a screen from 195 to 200. Water's only coming in the well from 195 to 200 feet below land surface because that's where the screen is. The rest is a solid pipe. The same 200-foot bedrock well may only have 50 feet of casing. And so water can get in anywhere from 50 feet below land surface down to 200 feet below land surface. And so understanding those issues is really important, especially for older wells that may not have that much casing as far as bedrock wells go. Here's an example again from a Camp Algonquin, which is in a Chicago suburb. It's a camp that has its own well. So this is actually a non-community water supply well, but it's a great example because it shows, if you look at the geology number 18 on the bottom right, they hit limestone at 189. And then at 257, they hit shale, which is an aquitard. It's basically cemented clay, so water doesn't flow through it. So they stopped. And then when they put the casing in, you can see they use PVC to 179. This is number 15. And then they use black steel casing for the bottom 20 feet. And that's because they need to seat that into the bedrock, and it has to be torqued, and you'd probably bust the PVC. But steel is much more expensive than PVC, so the driller used the steel where he needed to, which is 10 feet into the bedrock. So the limestone started at 189. So they put the casing in to 199, and below that there's no casing at all. So from 199 to 260, water can get in this well from the formation if there are any cracks or fissures in the rock. And again, this is also a artesian well because the top of the bedrock is at 189 or 187 if you want to count the broken limestone. The static water level is only 130, so it's up into the clay. And when they pumped it at 25 gallons a minute for 2 hours, it dropped to 160. And so they pumped it twice as hard as they knew they were going to need, so that they could be sure that it would, after 2 hours, it only dropped 30 feet. And if you look back at number 5, they put in a 12 gallon per minute pump, and they set it at 160, which they don't expect to get to based on the work they did. So yeah, everything's on a log if they're properly filled out and the state actually requires those things. There's a lot of good information on these, and this is a very typical bedrock well in that area. So I mentioned poor construction issues we have. Well construction codes changed a lot. I need to change that from 30 plus years to probably 50 plus years these days because a lot of some codes are that old. But because existing wells are grandfathered in, we still have wells in pits. So I mentioned the pitless adapter when I showed that example. And in northern areas where you have a frost line, you have to worry about freezing in the winter. You don't have the pump pumping through a pipe out through the top of the well. Where if you're in a southern area where it doesn't freeze, we see a lot like in Arizona or Texas, we see wells that actually even have the pressure tank sitting outside by the well. They don't have to worry about frost or any of those issues. But in northern climates you do. So the pitless adapter was invented in the early 60s so that you could run a pipe horizontally to your home 4 or 5 feet below land surface and stay below the frost line. Before that, you put your well top 4 or 5 feet below land surface and had it in a pit so that you wouldn't have to deal with freezing pipes. And we still see wells in pits today, which is the problem. And we also see a lot of old hand dug wells like the one I grew up on. It's still in use today. And they're really not safe, and they really can't provide protection from surface contamination. And the issue with a pit or an old hand dug well, especially one that may be abandoned, is not only do they provide an opportunity for contamination, but they're also a safety hazard. And so as examples, I showed this well earlier on the bottom. Walt Kelly, who was the head of our groundwater section, took this during a project where we were sampling large diameter wells. But the picture on the upper left is of a well it's in a little well house, and it had a piece of plywood over it, and the woman stepped on it and broke and she fell in and killed her. But you can see this well house, all that gray stuff on the ground is probably insulation, old insulation. There's a little funnel there that's probably for oiling the pump. You know, this isn't safe in any way. And, you know, every time she goes in there, she may be knocking stuff into the well that's eventually making its way into her water. And so Washington State Department of Ecology is the agency in Washington State that regulates well construction and drillers. And they had a blog for a while that where I took this information. And this other picture, Don Kelderman, is from Southern Illinois. And he was investigating his family roots and was staying at the same bed and breakfast I was for a meeting. And he showed me these pictures. And he found a dead goat in a well. And, you know, its ribs are sticking out. That's one of the most disgusting pictures you can imagine. But a lot of people may just have a big piece of tile. You can see the pieces of stone down lower. And this well luckily was not in use. But we, as you'll see another picture here in a minute, we see a lot of wells that aren't sealed. That can really be a problem. So what should you do? You know, we tell well owners they need to, if it's in a pit and it's a, you know, regular 6-inch casing or 5-inch casing, to extend that pipe up to the surface and fill that in. And if you need to install pitless if you're in a cold climate, but talk to, you know, your local well drillers and others to find out what's the best thing to do. Not only, again, is it for the sake of those pits can flood, and unless your well cap is, you know, completely watertight sealed, you're going to have that water get in your well, and it's likely going to get contaminated, especially with bacteria. So the same thing with abandoned wells, because well logs weren't required until at least the 60s, and a lot of times later, there's no records of all the old wells that are no longer used. And so we actually feel like there's probably more undocumented wells out there that aren't in use than those that we have on file that are being used. And that's, you know, people find those in very horrific ways sometimes. But if you're a well owner and you have an old well that's not sealed on your property, you should abandon it, fill it in properly so that it can't, one, be a source of contamination. If somebody spills something or throws something, you know, we have people who think, oh, there's this big 3-inch or 3-foot diameter hole that I can just throw my old cans in and stuff. You know, if someone gets hurt falling in, or those contaminants reach somebody else's well and they get sick, you could be liable. And it's certainly not worth it. It's best just to seal them. So again, a couple more pictures. There's a horse that fell into, both of these pictures, by the way, are also from the Washington State Department of Ecology in their blog. Yeah, so Katie Sue here fell in the well, and they're trying to pull her out. I think she was okay. But the more interesting one is a Sheldon man falls 45 feet into a well that was in his backyard that he didn't know was there. So he bought this property. There's an old dug well there. Somehow it got covered up, and he stepped on it and fell in, and he walked away. He was very lucky. Now, we just had a case in here. We have a downhole camera, and so a woman called us that lived about an hour south of Champaign. She said that she was mowing her front yard, and this was last September, I think. And all of a sudden, the wheel started to get stuck, and there was a small hole in her yard, and she was on a riding mower. And so she asked us if we would come down and take a look. So we took our camera thinking this is either going to be an old cistern where the caps broke or something else that's right in the middle of her front yard. No, it was a 20-foot dug well, old hand dug well, and she's so lucky it had no cap on it, and it was 3 foot or so diameter, and it just so happened that she broke a hole through the top of it without actually falling in. And so yeah, we took pictures, and they're just everywhere. And then, well, we figured out talking to her and her husband that the well probably dates to 1910 when the house was originally built there. The newspaper clippings here are the same. These are all, you know, in the 90s. These all came from, we used to have a groundwater education coordinator. 3 of these are Springfield newspapers. The third one is from Midland, Texas, when Jessica McClure fell in a well. Those of you old enough to remember, it was covered live on CNN. It took, I want to say, a little over a day for them to dig her out. She fell into a well that I think was, I want to say was like 8-inch or 10-inch diameter, really small. She was really small, I guess. But yeah, now she's a mother of 3, and that was, I think, in 95 maybe, or around there. So these things happen. People get killed and don't realize, you know, the other folks don't hear about it necessarily. But if you have a well, or you know someone, or if you're with the county health department, doing any kind of messaging related to abandoned wells is really important. And there's also some programs, depending on the state, where they will cost share sealing an old abandoned well. And sometimes that's through a soil and water conservation district, or a watershed district. You can call and try to find out if there's anything locally that might help. So groundwater and health gaps. So I want to point out the groundwater is really complicated. Many times there's multiple aquifers, like I mentioned, and there's also dug and bored wells where there are no aquifers. Water issues just aren't straightforward. And, you know, for instance, I was part of a work group that worked with, met at Johns Hopkins University to talk about private well issues. And one of the issues they listed, which they'd taken right off EPA's website for community water supplies, was about algal blooms. Well, we don't have algal blooms in private wells. And so it's not a community water supply. They act very differently in a lot of cases. And so understanding those things, as well as groundwater versus drinking water samples. You know, if you collect a sample from a well itself, or from a spigot near the well, that water quality could be very different than the water coming out of the kitchen tap, because of any treatment the well owner may have, the type of pipes they may have in their home, and the chemistry of the water. You know, if you have lead pipes or galvanized pipes or copper pipes and it's aggressive water, you may be seeing those things in your kitchen tap that wouldn't be in a groundwater sample. So all these things matter. And when health professionals sometimes will come in and want to do a study looking at water quality, and want to blame groundwater as the cause of some health issue, you really have to understand all the geology in the area, all those things. We had some folks from CDC who wanted to do a project with us, and they want to do it multi-state. And when we start showing them all of the different aquifers with different water chemistry, even in Illinois, there's no way that you can relate that and you know, make inference scientific. You can't. Yeah, it's too complicated. You'd have to sample. You have to treat each one as a separate set of data. And the last thing is, a lot of people, for, you know, we don't know how many, may have their own treatment, or they may use bottled water instead of using their well water for drinking. I don't know how many well owners have said, well, we don't drink the water, but, and so trying to do any kind of health study without having that information won't be valid. And so those types of studies are very difficult to do because of that. And my point is, you know, I'm not a health professional. I know a lot about health issues because I've been running this program for almost 10 years, and it's really a public health related program. But I rely on public health departments, you know, especially state health departments, for information that's related to public health. And we tell well owners they should go to their doctor or their county health department or local health district to get that advice if it's about their health, because it's not our purview, so to speak. But we all have a lot to learn from each other, and a team really should have both sorts of folks on it, because we look at the world a little differently in some cases. And you know, we run into cases where you have one group of folks who think that they know everything, and They're going, bull in a china shop trying to make heads or tails of stuff. And there's just complications related to aquifers or related to even other sources of health issues, just like lead. You can't assume it's from the pipes whenever it might be an older home that likely has lead paint, all those sorts of things. So in the lagoon example, we all, like I said, we all have a lot to learn. I put a group together of well professionals and regulators to develop an assessment tool, which I'll show in a minute, I think. And as we met and talked about septic systems, someone mentioned, well, what about lagoons? And I had no idea that in some states, a private home can have a lagoon as their wastewater treatment system. And Illinois is one of them. I'd never seen it. And one of our county health department folks pointed out that they have one in their county. But other states, Oklahoma, Nebraska, I'm sure there's others, where you're allowed to have a lagoon as your wastewater treatment for your private home instead of a septic or some other advanced treatment. And so it's, that was a aha moment for me, because I certainly feel like I've learned a lot over the years about private wells and sources and all that stuff, and something I'd never run across. And this is just an aquifer that's here in Central Illinois that I spent a lot of my career working with as far as water quality and water quantity. But this is how complicated glacial material can be. The sands are the tan colors, and so there's a Mahomet aquifer that's on the bottom. There could be other sands that are much less pronounced that are left by glaciers. And so as you move up through 3 sets of glaciation, in some places you could hit 5 or 6 different sand and gravel units. In the example I've showed here with the red arrow, it hits 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different sand formations. And any one of those may be a water supply. But how extensive they are, the bottom aquifer, the Mahomet, is a very large, extensive. It covers 11 counties, all that sort of thing. But a well at any given location, or at this location, could be in any one of those 5 aquifers, and they could all have different chemistry. And so understanding the geology and the depth of the well are critical to making any inferences about water quality over a certain area as far as doing any kind of health study. Okay, so the best thing to do is, if you're a health professional, develop a relationship with your scientific surveys, whatever they may be. Learn about the geology in your area and the aquifers, what your water sources are, what the water quality is, are there natural occurring contaminants, all that stuff. And it's really important to learn those things as you start looking at, if you're in an area where your district or county has a higher instance of some sort of cancer. Is it well water? Is it the groundwater? Is it because there's high, whatever it might be? You need to understand, are all the wells in one aquifer? How many people are drinking the water? All those things. And these folks can help you make heads or tails of those things. So I want to cover the private well class a little bit here. And so it's a 10-lesson class, as I mentioned. You sign up with an email address, and over 10 weeks, it sends you a lesson each week. It's a PDF attached to an email, so you're on your own to read it. Most of the folks who participate in our webinars, when we ask them, have you taken the class, they say no. We think it's very worthwhile for you if you're trying to learn more about wells to take it. It has a lot more information than we can cover in these webinars. And so we also do a lot of other things, videos, podcasts, and these webinars like today. And really the way I put it is, it's what can I do to help private well owners understand their wells and their water? Send them to our class and have them take it. It doesn't cost anything. It's an opportunity for them to learn more and have a basic understanding of things, even related to treatment and some of those topics. So this is our front page. You click on Take Our Free Class. We ask for an email address, a first name, and what state you live in. And what state you live in is really to show the folks that fund us that we're covering the entire country. We have people from all over the world take our class. Actually, And we're up over 11,000 people who've actually signed up and taken the class as of the end of the month, I think. So it's been vetted by a lot of professionals. As a matter of fact, the reason we offer NEHA CEs and now LEHP credit in Illinois is because the first 1,000 folks or so that took our class, 22% were environmental health professionals. And in the evaluation, they asked why they couldn't get credit for it. Or someone also said, well, why wasn't this available when I started my job? Because it would have given them a good basis for some of the well inspection work they do. And so that's when we reached out to NEHA and changed our program to include those options, so to speak. The class is available in Spanish if you're in an area that has native Spanish speakers that are on private wells. Not only is the entire class in Spanish, but there's also some of the videos that we've translated. Very fortunate being at the University of Illinois, which is a very large land grant based university. We had a young couple from Columbia who were here and translated all of this for us. And he was a civil engineering PhD student. Even the figures that we use this is a page of the class, has all been converted. And so for each of the 10 lessons, there's resources in our resource library with more information on those topics. It's meant to be like the lessons are 6 to 10 pages each. And if that doesn't resonate with someone, they can go to these other resources and read a little more about those topics. And again, there's a set of these for each of the 10 lessons. If you're a NEHA member or not, if you are a EHP that your state allows NEHA credit, we have a relationship with NEHA. We put our class on their website. And so even if you're not a member, you can create a login and you can take the 10 lessons there for free. And each one is worth 1 CE. So there's 10 CEs sitting on the table on NEHA's e-learning platform for those that can use those for credit. There's a quiz at the end of each one. This is what that looks like when you get into it. We do webinars like today every month, every July usually. We had to do this one in August because someone got COVID. But we usually every July we do Septic Systems 101. We bring in an expert who's a sanitarian from Massachusetts that used to inspect septic systems to help us with this one. And they're all available on our website and also on YouTube. We've done a few specialty ones, like this one's about lead. We've done this one twice. We did it in 2016 and 2018. Really, the information hasn't changed. We haven't done another one. But we brought in an expert here from Virginia Tech at the time and who spoke about research she had done, sampling homes with private wells where there's a real lead problem in Virginia in the Piedmont Aquifer. And so, it's really, when we get questions about lead, we refer folks to this webinar because it really explains all the details. We did create a page. It's just privatewellclass.org/lead where we provide resources. Especially EPA did a bunch of work after all the Flint stuff happened on filters and found that many of the certified products do a really good job of removing lead, even at high levels. We have a series of short training videos on different topics like what to do after a fire, what to do after a flood, what is a groundwater well, what should I do? What should I know about a shared private well, which is a bigger issue than most people realize? And why does my pressure tank keep losing pressure? We have another video similar to this on how does my pressure tank work that's had well over 400,000 views, which tells us that a lot of folks have pressure problems that are on private wells. And so if they have a traditional pressure tank, the things you can do to help increase the pressure in your home, that sort of thing. We started a podcast a couple years ago. I think we've put out 27 episodes. There are 2 seasons with 12 episodes each, and we've just started the 3rd season. They're meant to be about drinking water in rural America. So it's not just about private wells, it's also about community water supplies in rural areas. We have a sister program called wateroperator.org that provides resources for water and wastewater operators in small communities. Our communities under 10,000 people is our target. And so, you know, we've tried to do a range of things related to those issues. Yeah, it's worth checking out. And it's just drinkingwaterpodcast.org. I should have that on here somewhere. So the goal of our program really is to help well owners understand why their well is important, why they need to understand how it works, and how they can protect themselves from risk of, you know, adverse water quality or health outcomes. And so, but for EHPs, we actually have additional resources. I mentioned the class already on the e-learning website. We do workshops. This is probably dated. I think we've really stopped doing the in-person workshops around the country. But if you want to have an in-person workshop, you can contact RCAP regional staff and set one up, and they will come and gladly deliver that. We developed this assessment tool I mentioned earlier, and there is a guide, not soon, there is a guide in a tablet version, and we have a partners page and a partner newsletter. So the partner newsletter is really meant to be just for professionals, not well owners. It comes out once a month, has information that's relevant about things that are going on around the country, also about new resources that become available that we share from other sources that we think might be worthwhile. We have this brochure that you can see there in the middle. If you go down to the bottom of that page, there's an English version and a Spanish version. We've made this available for free. It's a trifold. We have it folded. We ship it to you. And it's something you can put on your, especially if you're like a health department, you can put it at your front window. As folks are sitting there, you know, is your well water safe? And it shows them it's something they can take home and look at. This is our newsletter. You know, this is an old dug well that's it's in Macomb, Illinois, which is on a public water supply. They've had public water since 1916, yet someone bought this home and found an old dug well next to their house in the back. And so we worked with all the groups that are mentioned here in McDonough County, especially the health department, and put on a well sealing demonstration. And so that's some bentonite going in the well to seal it. The well had a concrete cap with a 3-inch hole, which had been a hand pump. And the previous owner had used it as an ashtray. There were probably 10,000 cigarette butts down in that well and several lighters. The well was dry, it's only 22 feet deep, and we sealed it. And it's not close to their public water supply, but it's the idea that this well is even here. You can see how flat it looks on the house side. That's because it's starting to bulge out the foundation. And so that's another good reason to seal these. Another one of our newsletters about Septic Smart, if you're aware of that program. This is from last fall. Septic Smart last September was its 10th year. It's a great program to make awareness for people that use septic systems and have their own on-site wastewater. So the site assessments I mentioned, we brought in, we had, I think, 12 people that are experts on private well issues. And again, that included drillers, county health departments, state regulators, hydrologists, and extension. And we created a tool that's meant to be used by a qualified person who knows a little bit about wells to sit down with the well owner and do a site assessment, a well assessment, and then look at the geology or the well log and those things to come up with a set of recommendations based on their individual situation. What I can tell you, I probably sampled, well, probably thousands of wells, honestly, over my career, and every one is a little different. And everyone has a unique set of circumstances, whether that's because it's in a building or if you know they're storing pesticides right next to the well versus how deep it is, all those things. And it's an opportunity to meet with a well owner one-on-one, talk to them about what might be a vulnerability, show them the information you have on the geology if it's available, and remind them they need to test and all those things. So best management practices is an important part of why these assessments are done. This is just the first page. but it talks about, do you use the water? Who's the person doing the assessment and who's the participant, meaning the well owner. And so trying to figure out all those details. In the end, it's something you can hand back to the well owner with all the information. It's like a sanitary survey, if you're familiar with those that are done for public water supplies, but for private wells. And it's not binding, it's voluntary, but it's a really great way to educate well owners and promote best practices. So it also encourages communication. Many times well owners have said to me, I don't want to call my county health department. They might tell me I can't stop drinking my water. Well, I tell folks that 99% of the health departments in the country can't prevent you from drinking your water, even if it has a contaminant. But if you're worried, to call your health department and ask what kind of legal authority they have. But they're there to help you and to help you make your well safe for your family. And so not calling the health department is not a good option. They should always have those folks to lean on, and they're there to try to make things better and protect their health. So that's kind of the message we give. Again, this assessment tool, each of the regions, and this, I should have changed this number. I know it's up over 3,200 now, but they're doing these every year. Matter of fact, I know there's one health department that doesn't have a state health department that has a very small staff, and they've asked RCAP to come in, and whenever they have a well owner with a real a problem that's not easy to solve, they've asked RCAP to go do an assessment for them because they don't have the staff to go out and do field visits. And so we're working with folks all over the country that way, and trying to, and there's also now their program has sampling as part of it. So if someone has an assessment done, they can also get a water sample, all for free. Again, this is funded through US EPA, and it's really a unique and valuable program. And if you're interested, you have well owners who are interested in having an assessment done, you can contact us. This will be available as far as there were numbers and phone numbers for each of the regions on that one slide that showed RCAP across the country. But if you email us, I work with the 6 private well leads in the 6 regions, and we can certainly get you to them, and I do that regularly. There is a guide available that kind of helps you fill out each of these steps. There's a lot of information here. I think there's 18 sections, but it asks a lot of really good questions about your water quality, if you've tested, about your septic system, what kind is it, when's the last time you pumped it, what kind of treatment you have, what kind of pipes do you have, all those things to get a good feel for what's going on. And on our website, under Resource Library, you can go to Well Assess app. We do have a version for an Android tablet and for a Apple tablet, but there's also the wrist-based, the paper-based tool. You can download the PDF. It's a fillable PDF, and yeah, it's available for anyone to use. And there's a guide that goes with it. It talks about, what we've developed working with RCAP over the last 4 years with this is through their experience of doing these 3,200 assessments, they've streamlined the process and figured out the best way to do this. One is to look up and see if there's any information available about the well or the property prior to actually visiting with the well owner once they've requested an assessment. So this goes through all of those sorts of things. It has recommendations. It has a list of things that you should put in every assessment for the recommendations, like sample your well every year, some of those things. And what it does for this program is when an RCAP person is done with the assessment, they went out and they've taken pictures, they add that to the PDF, they give them, and then they can give the well owner an entire copy, email it to them, or print a copy if they want it, of all of the information that they've gathered about their well, whether there was a tank there at some point, whether there's anything nearby, all those things. So we do an online workshop related to this. It's a 4-hour workshop, and I'll mention this here because later in the questions I talk about outreach. So we do a 4-hour online workshop. We usually do it once or twice a year, but it shows examples of how to use the assessment tool, and it's also on doing outreach to environmental health professionals. So it covers best practices, and it is approved for credit. We haven't scheduled one yet for this year. I think we did one last December. And so if you're interested, you can email us or follow, if you follow our newsletter, we'll mention when that's going to happen. We've done several national conferences, and the reason I bring this up is because we recorded all the presentations, 2.5 days, all water professionals talking about different projects. Barb Luukkonen, I mentioned earlier, that did that study. She was our very first speaker who came and talked about the work they did and what they found out about well owner attitudes and all that stuff. And this is all available on our YouTube page. Yeah, I mentioned that here. But the private well conference, we've had 4 of them. 2 were in person, and then the pandemic hit, so we've had 2 online. But all the presentations have been recorded. This is not a research conference. It's a practitioners conference. It's for people who work with well owners. We brought in folks to talk about different kinds of treatment methods, stuff about, you name it. Even, Nebraska did a grout study. Their Health and Human Services Agency did a grout study looking at grout in different types of geologies, and they found in some cases state code doesn't work well with the type of grout that's being used, and that doesn't stay in the formation. I think that's a valuable thing for all the states to know and understand, and so we had them come and talk about those issues. We had our second one in Pennsylvania. Todd Giddings, who's shown here. This was about them developing a local private well ordinance because the state doesn't have any, right? We talked about Pennsylvania not having any rules. Well, he's a hydrologist, and in his local jurisdiction, they developed their own rules and passed basically a local law that requires more from drillers to be licensed and some of those things. License is the wrong word, to be qualified. So yeah, and it's all online. We've had several clinicians talk about things related to private wells, and then again we did one in 2022. And so yeah, all those are available. So this is our brochure I mentioned. This is a front. There's 23 million private wells in the country, and that's 60 million people that are using private wells, which is 18% of the population. So it's growing, just to put it plainly. And so this brochure again is free. We can send it to you. It talks about best practices and why folks should take our class. It's also available. Well, before I get to that, there's this yellow bar this yellow box isn't actually on the brochure. I highlighted it because that space was left blank on purpose so that you as a health district or a driller or whatever can put your own logo there. You can print labels and put them on there, and we have a lot of folks who do that. And so you can hand it out, so it's got your contact information, but it also tells them why they should sign up for the class and what things they should be doing on a regular basis. It's also available in Spanish if you work with Spanish native Spanish speakers that are well owners in your area. And so yeah, and if you want any of those, this is an older slide, it's from 21, but we do have some available. And if you're interested, we can mail this to you for free. And they come in bundles of 50, I think. And so the most anyone's ever requested were 2,000. I think that was the state lab in Indiana. And but a lot of folks pass these out and make them available. And we printed, yeah. Now I think we printed close to 90,000 of those brochures and given them all out. As far as questions for today, well, we did get a lot of questions. We're going to, again, there's a question and answer box, or there's a question box or a chat box on the Google window. If you have a question that we don't answer, you can ask it there. It looks like there's 3 that we've got already. But I'm going to go through some of the questions that were asked whenever you registered. First one is, I oversee a county health private well permitting program. We require testing for total coliform, arsenic, nitrates, pH, and VOCs, which I must say for a county health department, I've not heard of any other county health department that tests for all those things. So since local military base revealed PFAS in its groundwater, Should those substances be a required parameter for new domestic water supplies throughout the country or throughout our county? And really that's not our purview to make. And what we would suggest first is talk to the military, find out how widespread it is. If they have hired anyone to model and map a plume of where that might be, get their opinion on the possible size of the issue outside of the base, because that has other implications too, right? Legal ones and civil ones. But then, I would not guess you need to do it over the entire county, not knowing what county it is. If it's Island County in Washington State, that's a different issue than if it's, a county here in Illinois where we know, they're large counties, or in Texas, they're large counties, right? So, but one thing you could do, or we would suggest, is what we would probably do is try to sample some wells for PFAS throughout the county, and in the broader area, and see if you find anything. And if not, then you might even want to consider if you're within a certain distance of the base, or that sort of thing, because it's on one hand it's an added expense and it's not necessarily cheap to test for PFAS, but on the other hand, again, I said I'm assuming this is for installation of a new well. So if they're paying 12 or 14 or $1,000 or more for a private well, adding $300 or $400 for a PFAS test would go, to me, it's still a lot of money, $300 or $400. I'm not saying that, but especially if you're getting a loan to cover that, then that's spread out and all those things. But I'm interested in what's going on, and so I'm hoping that if you're here today, you'll email me, and that's my email address. And I'd like to learn more about what you're all doing, because it's actually really cool that you're requiring that testing to some degree. And I'd like to learn more about why VOCs, because that's a new one, especially. The other things are fairly common constituents, but you usually only find VOCs where there's a source that you've identified nearby. All right, we will have a contractor drill for our private well this year, and this is verbatim from what was asked. Does the pump have to be run constantly, or can we install a tank to hold the water? Therefore, there will not be wear and tear on the pump. Okay, so first of all, pumps don't run constantly. It either runs based on a pressure switch, if you have a traditional pressure tank. So you have an on-off switch connected to a pressure switch, or that's a pressure switch based on how the settings on your pressure tank. So maybe it's set to 40, 60 PSI. So 40 is the low end, 60 is the high end. So you pump water from your well until the pressure in the pressure tank gets to 60 PSI, and then it automatically shuts off. As you start using water that's stored in your pressure tank for whatever, bathtub, whatever it might be, and the pressure drops below 40, then the pressure tank, or then the well pump kicks on to try to keep the pressure up at 40 PSI. And then once it gets to, so you turn your water off, and once the pump gets, the pressure tank gets to 60 again, the pressure switch will turn that off. The other type of system, which are becoming more common today, use a variable speed pump. So it's, you might have a 1 or 2 gallon pressure tank just to get you started, but as soon as you turn on the water, the pump kicks on, and it'll run at a rate, can run at variable speed, so it's not a constant force of water. It runs at a rate that maintains a consistent pressure. And so with those pumps, they're more efficient because they're using the water you need at the time you need it and not running any other time. And so, but in both cases, it's not running constantly. And, honestly, asking this question suggests that you really need to become more familiar with the well processes and what to do about hiring a contractor. And in our class lessons, we talk about things about before you hire a contractor, these are things you should know. Like, you should have in the contract that the driller will give you a well log. We have cases where that doesn't happen, and then the drillers, for whatever reason, may decide that's proprietary information. So I suggest going through our class lessons before you hire a contractor to drill your well. It'll help you understand what questions to ask, what things are important to know about the driller in your contract, like that they're bonded and licensed, and get references, all those things. It's worth it. A well, depending on where you're at, we see wells as cheap as $7,000 or $8,000 in some more rural states, and as high as 40 or 50,000 or more in more populous states where groundwater may be deeper, like in California or New Jersey. California on the deeper end, but New Jersey on the populated end. And so, that's a bigger investment than your car. And hopefully you don't just go buy a car on a whim. You do your research and you decide what's best. And, I know I'm going to use this for the next 10 years, possibly. Well, you might be using for the next 40 years. And you want to make sure that the person putting it in knows what they're doing, does the right job, all those sorts of things. Is it recommended for people whose wells test positive for coliform to have a bacterial count test performed in addition to a total coliform test? So there's an argument or a disagreement, not even really that's the right word. There's two schools of thought on testing for coliform. One is it's a presence or absence test, which a lot of states require, and that says if there's any, it's going to be positive, and then you need to disinfect and you have a problem. But there's another school of thought that says whenever you do a bacterial count, it gives you more information, because when you don't know how many colonies are present whenever you do a presence absence test. You just know that there is at least something. But if you only have a few colonies, it could be that it got contaminated when you're collecting the sample and there's nothing wrong with your well or water system. Whereas if it's a few hundred or more, then you'll likely have a bacterial problem in your system. And so, really the first test, if you're going to test for bacteria, should be to do a coliform test that uses a count, colony count, if you will. Because it gives you just a little bit more information, and it'll help those who are trying to help you determine what the next course of action is. It'll give you a better feel. Just like, we work with people who have springs for their water supply. Their count is in the thousands sometimes, and they're just used to the water, but it's totally unsafe. And so knowing that matters is the bottom line. And what we recommend is once you've tested for total coliform, if you find it, then you need to test for E. coli, because that's E. coli is what can make you sick. But again, having any coliform in your well or any kind of bacteria, the reason we test for coliform is because it's ubiquitous in the shallow environment. And if you have it in your well, that means it found its way in somewhere. And that means you have a pathway into your well, and your well's not properly protected. And so it's a sign that you need to consider what's going on there. If you have a well that has a cover like those two we showed for those board wells that are just an old wood cover, you're going to have E. coli, or you're going to have coliform for sure, and any other kind of contaminant that can get into it. So it's meant to be an indicator that there's a pathway into your well. We live in the mountains, and this is paraphrased. This person sent me a really long email question about being in the mountains, having as much as 5 or 10 feet of snow. It's really cold in the winter, and so they wanted to know if they put a well house around their well, would this help, so that they, if their pump went bad in the winter, could they then, it'd be in a building and they could fix it, so to speak. So, and they mentioned pulling the pump, which means it's a submersible. So you can't just pull the pump on your well that I'm aware of. It would probably have to be done by a licensed contractor, and regardless, it would require a vehicle, either a rig or a special pump truck that can set up over the well to pull it out, because there's drop pipe, right? That the pump is pumping water up through a drop pipe. And so they won't have access to the well either way, whether there's 5 feet of snow on the ground or if you have a building around your well, they won't be able to set up over the well because there's not that much clearance for those trucks for that. So you talked about having a heated and climate controlled building. I don't, and with your pressure tank, and you said equipment, I think, but there's really no reason to do that. It's a lot of extra expense. You really should, if it can freeze in your area, then none of that stuff should be above ground. You should have a pit list that runs into your home, and all of your equipment and your pressure tank should be there where you don't have to worry about it freezing. You know, if you're gonna have a separate building for all of that, I can't think of why, but if there is a reason, like you don't have a basement and there's no place in the home, then just remember that if the heat ever stops in that building, your water is going to freeze and your pipes are going to burst. And so I don't know, there's another question related about standards for a building around our well house. And I don't know that there are any standards. It's not a typical thing because, again, you have to have access to the well, especially if you have a submersible pump. If you have a pump that's above ground, then that's a little different animal. But I don't know. You know, I say that our old Doug well had a well house, but that's only because all our piping was above ground, and where I grew up, it freezes in the winter. So we had a well house, and we kept a propane tank down there. So when the power went out, we'd have to go down. I mean, I remember at 2 in the morning, walking 100 yards into this pasture in freezing weather to turn a propane tank on so that our pipes didn't burst. It's a really poor way to have a well system, and it really shouldn't be that way. Troubleshooting water well problems after weeding out the normal culprits, and it mentions all those. What suggestions do we have specifically about a well that, I'm assuming it's not the well, it's the water is persistently yellow. They've shocked it, it keeps coming back. You know, iron can certainly cause that yellow color, but so can tannins. And tannins are, I don't know a lot about them other than they're not harmful, but they're certainly known to cause a yellow color. They can cause a musty smell and also an aftertaste in water. We do run across this once in a while where people have tannins in their water, and there are ways to treat that. I think there's anion exchange is one way. I'm not a treatment expert, but I will talk about that in a minute. But that would be the other option. I talked to one of our geochemists about this too, and that's the first thing he thought of as well, was it could be tannins in the water, and they do occur naturally sometimes. So I would check that out, and hopefully that's what it is. And again, it looks bad because it looks yellow, but it is harmless. Would you advise citizens to invest in water distillers, and what are the pros and cons? So, distilling water is a kind of an arduous process, and it takes out everything, every ion except the water itself. You're basically creating steam, and then the water's going into, everything's going out of it except the water itself. So you're purifying it that way. So it seems like overkill, and what again our geochemist Walt Kelly suggested is that you're also removing some of the good ions, if you will, the mineralogy that might be beneficial to the water, right? And so it's better to treat for specific contaminants that you have identified through sampling. So and you don't know what you have in your well water until you test. It may be totally fine, and many times it is totally fine, which is, and groundwater can be really safe and clean and all those things. But without testing, you really don't know. And so I also wanted to mention that the Minnesota Department of Health recently developed a document on treatment for homeowners or well owners. And my take on that is that every well owner should have a copy of that document. It's freely available, and it looks like this: home water treatment. So if you just Google MN home water treatment, it's the second or third option. And it step by step what to think about if you're going to add treatment. Here's what you need to know. It even talks about, so these labels on the bottom right from NSF, this gold seal and the UL, don't buy treatment equipment that doesn't have one of those symbols on it, because if you need treatment for a specific thing, you can find out from these organizations, which are third-party certifiers, what kind of equipment will work on that particular constituent, and then make sure that whatever you buy has one of these labels, which means it's been proven and certified to actually remove what it's supposed to remove. If you buy something without a label, you may be spending half the money, but in the end, it's someone not taking out any of the targeted constituent either. And so this thing goes through, and I'm just throwing manganese nitrate and arsenic up here. It's got, this is from this document. It does mention distillation as an option, but as we go further, it'll talk about what the benefits and pros and cons actually are. And so for almost everything, there's it tells you what kind of treatment will work and whether it's partially effective. Just like a softener will in some cases remove arsenic, even though it's not, and they don't have it labeled here, but we've seen that, that a softener, it'll co-precipitate arsenic with iron in some cases if you have an iron removal system with your softener. And so, sometimes there's partial benefits from other types of equipment, was my point. And so this talks about, there's treatment options that were just listed there. This document talks about how it works, the pros and cons, the costs, and what it removes. And so, yeah, and it may not cover everything, like anion exchange. Like I said, I'm pretty sure works for tannins, but it's not listed here, which I thought it might be. But you can find other information online or talk to the health department and find out more, or we can look up more information for you there as well if that's what you decide to do. But it's pretty handy. There's a lot of different processes. It talks about what they all are. Things like, so for instance, RO units, it talks about point of use versus point of entry, the third and fourth columns, or the fourth and fifth columns over. Arsenic is not a dermal risk. It's not, unless it's, way higher than you'd find in groundwater. It's really a drinking water risk. So there's really no reason to have a point of entry arsenic removal or RO unit for arsenic removal. And if you look at the cost difference, it's really clear that it's a waste of money, as well as one of the cons for RO units are the amount of water that they waste. By running it through an RO system, you're running, I think, 5 gallons to waste for every gallon that ends up being treated water. And so if you're doing that for your whole house, for showers and washing and everything else, there's really no reason for that. And it's, you can look at the cost and see the difference. It's almost 10 times as much. What are the key considerations for transitioning a private well into use for a business, winery, bakery, restaurant, etc.? Well, the first consideration is understanding the amount of water you're going to need. Because if you're going to use it, let's say for a winery where maybe you have to irrigate, is the well enough for that? Will it have a sustainable yield for the water that you need? Yeah. Other than that, it's really about, it isn't a private well anymore. If you have at least 25 people a day for at least 6 months a year, it's considered a public water supply, and it's a non-community water system. And if it's different people every day, let's say you have 5 employees, but then you serve, more than 20 guests, then it's considered a transient system. And if it's the same people, like you have 25 employees, then it's a non-transient, non-community water system. They're all regulated as public water supplies under the Safe Drinking Water Act. So you're subject to mandatory testing by a certified lab, and you also probably need a licensed water operator maintaining your system. You need to talk to your state primacy agency, your regulatory agency. Like in Illinois, that's the Illinois EPA. In New York, it's the Department of Health. Every state's a little different. It's the folks that regulate community water supplies under the Safe Drinking Water Act. And most states have a little bit nuanced rules of their own related to the national rules, like for the MCLs. If you want some help with that, contact us. I'll put our email address up at the end, but we can certainly get you in touch with. We work with a lot of the state primacy agencies on our other program, and so we can certainly find that information out for you. What are some of the most effective outreach strategies in the field to connect to larger audiences, especially those who live in more rural communities? This is only part of the question. The part was they're reaching some demographics and not others, and I didn't put all of that on here. And so I mentioned before, we have a class that discusses outreach. It's based on a research project we did for CDC 8 or 9 years ago, where we reached out to 91 programs around the country that do outreach to well owners, and we compiled information from all the questions we asked them about how they were successful, what methods did they use, what would you do differently, all that sort of stuff. So our 4-hour class covers that, as well as the assessment tool. We don't have a date for that, and so as I was putting this together, I decided that we'll make this our June webinar, our monthly webinar, and it's not going to be a 4-hour webinar. It'll be our normal 2-hour class, but it's just going to focus on outreach. We haven't done that before, but I need to update a lot of that information anyway, not necessarily update, but create new talking points for it and stuff like that. And so this is a good reason to do that. So if you can wait till June, we'll have, that's what this webinar will be about, is how to do outreach to well owners. And if not, contact us and contact me, and we can discuss this further. But there's a lot to a methodology to really reach out to well owners. And we developed a paper out of this that talks about a 4-step process and how to identify the folks that you want to reach, and more than I can really talk about here, but I'd be glad to talk with you further. And yeah, we've worked, yeah, okay. Is there a risk to drinking water if a new well is drilled 10 feet away from a shallow bored well that's still active? So it really depends on the situation, especially the geology. But if your bored well is fairly shallow, which I assume it is, say 30 or 40 feet deep, and you're going to drill a new deeper drilled well into an aquifer that's, say, more than 100 feet deep, as long as it's properly constructed and the casing goes well beyond the bored well, then it probably won't be a problem. But drilling that new well could affect your bored well. It really, again, depends on the geology, and also how close bedrock is to the surface. So like if your bored well goes all the way to the bedrock, and then you're drilling into bedrock, then I'll step back from what I said, and it could affect it, just because you don't know where the fractures are or where they're going. And it's not likely that the bored well is directly inputting to the bedrock, but it could be. Again, without seeing the geology and knowing, there's too many different situations where, I'd say if this was all glacial environment above the bedrock, then as long as the well screen is well below the shallow bored well, 2 or 3 times the distance, then it's likely it wouldn't affect it. Yeah. Okay, so it's almost 3 Central Time. I'm going to pull over the questions we have. Let me, it's like we have 3 questions so far. Hang on one second. I'm trying to bring that up. It does not want to come up. Why not? I've never had that happen before. I can't get it to go to full screen. Well, that's not good. Can everybody see this? You can see this. Katie, good enough?
Yeah, okay. I think it's good enough, Steve.
So what are the specific testing requirements for water testing and well inspection for loans and home purchases? That really varies by where you live and who your loan is coming from. And we do a webinar for real estate professionals where we get into this a little more, because there's actually some bad information out there. But for a HUD loan or a FDA loan or a veterans loan, through those programs, they use HUD's requirements. And there's a 1,000-page document that is used for those home purchases. And the first thing it says is that if you can hook up to a public water, hook up to a public water supply, you have to. And then if that's not an option, then it says you have to test for whatever the local jurisdiction requires. The local jurisdiction requires. And if they don't have rules, then you have to do what the state requires. And if they don't have rules, you have to sample for things under the Safe Drinking Water Act. So we've tried to work with HUD and others in USDA about that, because if you're in an area where they don't have state or local testing requirements, that means you have to test for everything that a community water supply does, and that is thousands of dollars, and no one actually does that. And so, and again, it depends on who your loan is going through. Some banks have their own requirements for testing. Yeah, it's really variable, and you'd have to, very dependent on where you live as far as what's required. Or like in Illinois, we have a checklist that you have to fill out as a seller, and you have to verify that you know of no adverse effects. But what we tell well owners is, do not buy a home with a well unless you've had it sampled, or unless they've got a sample they can provide you that shows the water quality. Or even if they've tested the water, found something like arsenic, and they put in treatment to remediate it, I tell folks that that's a good thing, that they've been proactive, they're not trying to hide anything, and that you have a way to treat the water to keep it safe for you. But again, when you have a home inspection done, I recommend having a well inspection done and a water sample collected for your own peace of mind. Is there a well inspection checklist you can share with me? Is it electronic or paper only? So it's not a well inspection checklist. There are states that have those, and again, I'll refer to the webinar we do for realtors, because Wisconsin has a really good one, that Wisconsin DNR, that in Washington, in Wisconsin, they have a really cool, actually makes total sense concept that says you don't have to do a well inspection, but if you do one, you need to have a licensed contractor do it, and they have to fill out this form that we've provided. They don't even want you to send them the form. They're trying to make sure that they're protecting homeowners and that the well inspection's done the right way. And so if you go into our webinars, or you email us, we can send you a link to the last realtor webinar we did, where we highlight that document. And it is downloadable, it's a PDF. On the issues in the news slide, would you explain the picture? Why is the vegetation around the object dead looking? Why is the object so high? What is it? Okay, yeah. So that slide had contamination, flooding, drought, whatever it had on it. That well is in along a stream that floods. So in order to protect the wellhead, they put the casing 10 feet above land surface. So to get to that wellhead, they have to be on a big truck to work on it. And they've elevated, and so it's solid casing. Not, most wells there's a minimum requirement in a lot of states that you need to have at least, the well casing has to come up 18 inches above land surface. Well, for those folks, they put their well 10 feet above land surface. And so that if it floods, it can't overtop the well. And they're in a floodplain. They're right in the floodplain for that stream. It's right next to a bridge. That's why I stopped and took a picture. I was driving on it, so it's on one of our state highways. And as far as the object, the vegetation around the object dead looking, I didn't pay any attention there. It might have been the time of year. It might have been in, November in Illinois when everything looks dead. And so, but that's why it's so high. And it's just a well, which, it's actually really smart. It makes it a little inconvenient to get to. But the only time you should be opening your well is if a contractor is trying to, if you're pulling the pump or one of those things. And they've put it, they've done so that they can get to it as well. It's in an open area and all that stuff. Okay, and that's the last question we have. And so thanks for everyone who attended today. Again, here's the information if you have any questions, info@privatelow-class.org, and you can get the handouts off the handout tab. And again, thank you for participating. Thanks, Katie.
Thank you, Steve.